Today I have the immense pleasure to, first of all, welcome all of you here today, but also to welcome Gabriela Rangel and Hans-Ulrich Obrist. Hans-Ulrich Obrist is the artistic director of Serpentine Galleries, and Gabriela Rangel is, Gabriela, please jump in here, but I've forgotten somehow that your current title.
I am like an independent. That's my current title.
Is that how you want to be shown? An independent curator that has worked on, that has worked previously with Malba, but also with amazing Latin American artists. So today, I think we're going to talk about multiple things with a specific interest and focus on the wonderful book Conversations in Chile, which was published at the end of 2024, that both Hans-Ulrich Obrist continues on his conversations kind of series, drawing from Colombia, but also from Mexico and Brazil, but also in which Gabriela Rangel has written a wonderful introduction for. It's also really important that although they could not be here with us today due to prior commitments, but to acknowledge the role of Pedro Montes, the publisher of the book in his gallery D21 in Santiago, Chile, but also Karen Marta, the editor, and who has worked with both Gabriela and Hans in many capacities. It's really interesting today that we're having this conversation, not only in light of the show that I've co-curated with Marita Garcia, who's the chief curator at Malba, Latinoamericano, but also in the context of Year of Culture 2025, Qatar, Argentina, and Chile. And in many ways, this is what we were saying at the beginning here, it's not just a celebration of the book, but it's also a celebration of the show, and it's also the celebration of the world coming together at this very specific moment. With that said, I think it would be great to just outline some of the topics that we're speaking about today, which divulges and gets into the creative practices of specifically Chilean artists, but also in many ways of Latin American artists. It bridges the conversations between architecture and art and provides and references cultural and historical contexts. With that, I think it would be really interesting to think about how this project came about. What was one of the first starting points for both of you?
Issa, is it working? Yeah, thank you so much, Issa, and congratulations on the truly wonderful exhibition, Latinoamericano. And I mean, the beginning is really the beginning kind of my conversation project, because I began as a teenager when I was like 16, 17 to travel around Europe by night train and to visit artists. And at a certain moment felt that, it would be interesting to maybe record these conversations. Jonas Mekas was really key in this whole thing, because he told me at a certain moment, you meet so many amazing artists, and one day you will regret if you don't record them. And he even, encouraged me to actually film a lot of these conversations, which was kind of, I think, an important moment, because otherwise a lot of this archive wouldn't exist. And one of the kind of early conversations is, of course, with the surrealist Mata, because I kind of met him through Suzanne Paget when I worked at the Musée d'Art Moderne, and Suzanne was curating this Giacometti show. And that was actually my first ever museum job, is that she basically said, when she did a Giacometti show, that she wanted me to visit all the people who had known Giacometti, and so who were still alive. And it was Balthus, that was Mata, Cartier-Bresson, many of these artists are no longer with us today. And so that's kind of how I found out about Chile for the first time, was by kind of visiting Mata. And of course, also about this amazing kind of interdisciplinarity of the practice, because Mata told me about his working collaborations with Buckminster Fuller, and they did. And I remember we were in this studio, and he showed me many, many drawings Buckminster Fuller and he made together. So, Buckminster Fuller would kind of draw a dome, a geodesic dome, and then Mata would start to kind of fill it out, and then it would go the other way around. Mata would sort of draw a city, and Buckminster Fuller would work on it. It's kind of still quite unknown body of work, which is really, really magical. And then over the years, I started to record more and more conversations. The collaboration with Karen Marta was essential and is essential in making these conversations into books, because Karen has been the main editor really of many of my interview books. There's so far probably about, I think, 4,000 hours in the archive. And so little by little, there started to be, of course, patterns, that connect. And I think one thing which was interesting was that at a certain moment, the kind of oral history project went from sort of individual interviews to more collective interviews. I started to be interested in this idea how we could actually, in a way, map movements. So I started to, I would talk to all the members of the German, or International Zero movement. I would make a portrait with Rem Koolhaas of metabolism. We would go to Japan many times to visit all the members, then still alive, of the architecture movement, Metabolism, and that would become a book. And then, of course, at a certain moment, I realized that doing these recurrent conversations, it also was kind of an exercise maybe in portraiture of cities. And the person who really made me aware of that was somehow David Sylvester, because David Sylvester, interviewed not only Francis Bacon all the time, and that's, of course, also interesting, that a conversation, in order to go really deep, has to be repetitive. But he also made me aware that one sort of would go back to cities again and again. So he would, for example, make a book of all his New York conversations. It's kind of a portrait of New York at a specific moment. And that led then to do these, basically books about specific countries or about specific cities. We started to do the Brazilian, conversations in 2 volumes. And of course, it looks a lot at, it's very fascinating in the panel before. I love that sort of emphasis of interdisciplinarity, and I'm particularly interested in moments, also in the neo-avant-garde of the 60s, in all these countries, in Brazil, here in this case in Chile, but in many, many other countries where, we went beyond the fear of pooling knowledge, where basically the disciplines kind of came together. And that's how then the Chile book kind of came about, because I basically started to work with Chile through Smiljan Radic, because we did a pavilion at the Serpentine. We built pavilions once a year in front of the Serpentine. It's an architectural commission. At a certain moment, after 2012, we went into a younger generation. Actually, Sue Fujimoto was the first younger architects in the scheme. And then soon after was Smiljan Radic in 2014. And of course, there's such an amazing architecture scene in Chile. Of course, also Alejandro Aravena, who is building the museum here. Who is, of course, very present also in Manuela's Pritzker Prize story as I think as the chairman, if I'm not wrong, he's the chairman of the jury of the Pritzker Prize. So there's so many connections, to Chile with architecture. And then, in a way, Smiljan said, you must come to Chile. There are all these artists. So it was kind of his encouragement. And then we met Pedro Montes, and he basically came up with this idea that we could do a kind of a marathon where I would visit lots of pioneers in Santiago de Chile. And so we made a very intense 3-day kind of visit. And then all roads somehow led to Gabriela Rangel, because Karen Marta, who started to edit the book, and also Pedro talked about your amazing knowledge, Gabriela, of also Chilean artists of the 60s and 70s in exile, because of course many of the artists, Sylvia Wittmann, for example, Palacios Wittmann is an example for that, Carmen and Butchart, we're going to talk about all these artists later. So then Gabriela joined the project, and we started together to make several of the interviews in exile. So in a way, it went on over several years, and that's how the book came about.
I think you've touched on a lot of different things, but Gabriela, sorry, I think it would be also interesting to hear your perspective of why you wanted to participate within this wider discussion here today. Well, in general, with the project overall, because you yourself are also very interested in the archives.
Yeah. Yes. I started to work with the book curator. I won't say that she's an editor. She's a book curator, Karen Marta, who's not here, unfortunately. When I was the director of visual arts at the American Society, I invited her to make books because I was enamored. And I met her through you, by the way, and Pedro Reyes, my friend Pedro Reyes, who's a great artist and who was your co-participant in conversations in Mexico, right? And so I met Karen Marta and I said, if you were going to work with me in Latin American art, we have to travel to Latin America. There it's mandatory. So we went to Chile and to Argentina. And in Chile, I was very concerned because I know I'm an archivist like him. The difference is that I don't have an archive. My archive is here. Anyway, so I thought these artists are really important because they broke the mold of political art, and they need to be in Hans Ulrich Obrist's archive. So, you know, I talked to Pedro Montes, who's an old friend, and all the parts, you know, went together. They came across, you know, all of them.
It's interesting because
For the project.
this is a running theme, even with the previous panel, this multidisciplinary, this connections between, you know, very different fields of thought and practice. And that's almost how this book has also come about. So in the book, you know, you talk to and you have conversations with a wide variety of kind of creatives in the cultural scene, poets, writers, artists. Hans, you've also worked with performance artists, but also with architects. And I'm interested to explore that relationship a bit more. And I think maybe the best way when we're thinking, especially in the Qatari context, we can start with poetry and how poetry was really explored and engaged with specifically in this scene, especially considering, you know, the oral traditions in Qatar, and poetry still becoming a very important facet of everyday life here.
Yeah, thank you. It's actually really interesting, I think, how poetry is at the core often of all these endeavors. And in a way, also through having these oral histories of, you know, pioneering artists, it's of course possible to kind of connect to also their inspiration. So it's in a way a possibility to access very directly art history. I mean, I mentioned Mata before, you know, and through my conversations with Mata, it was a possibility to really access, you know, the whole history of surrealism of many artists who were no longer around because, you know, sometimes we arrive too late. And in Chile, I was really very heartbroken that there was no more way to interview, you know, the architects of the Open City project. Because for me, the Open City projects, and I kind of want to answer through the Open City with a concrete case study to your great question. Because in a way, the Open City project for me was always a great curatorial kind of inspiration. Because it was basically a poet and also an architect. Alberto Cruz was the architect, and then I think Godofredo Yomi was the poet. And these two protagonists started in the 70s an amazing, you know, architectural practice or an architecture utopia, a concrete utopia, where they basically created buildings. They created a whole, it's more than buildings, they created a whole landscape in a way of architectural structures without a master plan. And for me, it's always been really interesting, you know, as a curator, I was also very inspired by Jona Friedman about that, how we can actually create, in a way, things, you know, in that sense, in my field, exhibitions, without necessarily having a master plan of a checklist. Because for me, that was always far too much top-down. I was interested, how can we bring bottom-up elements in it, you know, self-organization and things like that. And I was very fascinated how the Open City project actually did do that. They started together with the students to build buildings without necessarily knowing where they went. What is also so interesting to talk about it here in Doha is that a lot of it has to do with the desert. You know, if you look at the Open City project, it's deeply connected to the sand dunes. You know, they basically developed these dreams, this imagination to build, and you know, a lot of their sort of hospitality guest houses were actually raised above the dunes. It's also so interesting in relation to the notion of hospitality, which plays, you know, such a big role here, and the idea of actually working, you know, with dunes and sand dunes and the desert in a very sort of ad hoc way. So they would, I mean, to give you the concrete example, they would basically write on a blackboard, you know, a poem, and then together with the students go out into the dunes and kind of build that poem as, you know, a building. And of course, you know, it was too late to interview them, but it keeps coming up through people, you know, who knew them. We get the direct oral history. And at the same time, what is also interesting that we have is Raul Zurita, a poet, a leading poet. He's been a candidate even for the Nobel Prize occasionally, a leading poet who actually developed possibilities how to bring poetries not only into the desert, but actually poems into the sky. Because he actually realized, during the Pinochet time, that he wanted to use airplanes in a very different way. So he created to write poems in the sky. So this was the opposite of the military use, of airplanes, and created these amazing poems in the sky. But he also created poems as billboards. He created poems in the city. And I think what is so fascinating about the whole kind of 60s avant-garde, and Gabriela knows so much more, of course, than I do about that, because for me it was a very recent discovery and field of research, but it's how it all connects to the city. I mean, Lotte Rosenfeld, to whom we dedicate the book, because it was too late to interview her, she was unwell, talked a lot about that, about this idea. And actually, this is, in a way, maybe the pattern which connects all these disciplines, that they all somehow did poems in the city, performances in the city. The city was, in a way, the palette for these artists to do performances.
I was going to say something complementary to what you're saying, that it's about not only poetry as a source, but I think language at large was very important in Chile, to the extent that in Chile occurred something unthinkable in the 70s. They opened an office for cybernetics in order to organize the distribution of information of the state and the economy. This sounds like very today, right? But it was organized by Guy von Sipe, who was a student of Maldonado in Ulm, and became a historian of design in Latin America. I met von Sipe. He's alive, he's very lucid, and a guy, maybe you know him, Stafford Beer, who was a theorist of cybernetics. Both of them worked for the government of Chile and opened this office called CyberSyn. If we think about 1970, opening this office and having, someone like Juan Downey there, working with the same, issues in the arts. Not only the dictatorship, is that the language was there, and language was problematized in a way that made this generation brilliant. It's a very unique generation, and that's why their work is not, one, porno miseria, never. It's not porn misery, and second, it's not propaganda. It's not ideologically driven. It's very sophisticated as a political mode of dissidence. So I think, anyway, this is what I wanted to say.
I think it's great what you guys, and just picking up on some of the wider themes and topics you're discussing here. I mean, we're seeing that at the forefront is innovation, and the way that artists in Latin America, and specifically Chilean artists, are thinking beyond the limitations of their current realm, but also in the way that they're no longer also in many ways referring only to the dictatorship, right? I mean, Gabriela, you mentioned this, and I think it would be interesting for you to expand, is that framing Chilean artists under the lens of only the Pinochet regime is almost reductive.
It is, for the reasons that in Chile, poetry is really important. It was always important. They have Nobel awarded poets, but beyond that, they have a very strong, literature. Can we think the present without Bolaño? I don't know, it's difficult, right? Quoting a little bit of, modernist painter, a modernist painter like Cézanne, who said that you're not a painter unless you paint in gray. So Chileans understood the gray in all its dimensions and gradients, and they applied that to the visual arts. They were, if we see that Lotte's no más is in every demonstration today, we see that they jump into the reality and they stay in the reality. So they change the reality.
Hans, is there anything else you'd like to add to this from your perspective?
Yeah, I was just thinking, how fascinating it is that even Cecilia Vicuña, who is so central in your exhibition, with this very beautiful installation, which very much, I think, the heart of the show in the center. I think it's also a place to rest. It's a place to think. It's almost like a place to meditate. And Cecilia Vicuña talks in the conversation about works like this as spatial poems. And of course, it began again with her doing that in the streets. She basically very early on created these ephemeral things, ephemeral works, also not only in the street, also facing the ocean. She talked about these precarious kind of installations. And of course, poetry is very central also for Cecilia Vicuña, one of the most well-known artists, certainly, in the book, who also has been instrumental in actually translating Mapuche poetry. And has in a way played a very central role in that sense as a translator.
Absolutely. And I mean, we took that approach also within the exhibition, and specifically the work that you're referring to, Quipu Desaparecido, is really looking at a way of reactivating this, long lost tradition, and that was in fact outlawed by the Spanish conquistadors when they arrived on the continent. I think it's really interesting when we're thinking about these interconnections, is this idea of collectives. And I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more about what do these roles of collective and community mean, and how is that something that is being shown here?
Well, I have to say something. There is a previous book to your book of interviews, but that book is really boring. Because the artists, they stick to the rule. They talk about the canonical approach, they talk about the dictatorship, they talk about, their formations, everything. But I think Diamela Eltit said something really important in this book. And she said that the difference between, for instance, the Escena de Avanzada, who was the group gathered around Nelly Richard, who's a very important theoretician and is a French woman, feminist, who more or less introduced the French theory in Chile. And the other group is CADA, Colectivo de Artistas. The two of them, people usually confuse them, but they're different. And the difference, according to Diamela, was that CADA was not aligned to any institution, whereas Escena Avanzada was, in a way. I don't understand that distinction with the time, but I think it's important to know that they felt that they were not close to any institution, that they were independent. And maybe that's why they made this audacious, epic, performances, which we were commenting this morning. And I think you can talk, Hans, about that, about the desert, the skies, the milk, all these, very audacious and epic actions.
Yeah, maybe you want to talk about, before I do that, about Lotti Rosenfeld, no? Because it's key, these performances of Lotti, which...
That's true, and this book is dedicated to Lotti. So it's very important to talk about her.
And then there's, of course, also Eugenio Dittborn, because, Eugenio did actually a performance with oil in the desert. There's, again, a connection, to the desert there in a similar way to Open City. But Eugenio also, Eugenio is actually the first Chilean artist I met, because sort of in the early 90s, there was a big show Caroline Christopher Garfi did in Rome, and we met there, and he talked a lot there about circulation. And there is a wonderful work, because you met him also, Issa, in the research of your show, and there's a wonderful work in the exhibition, which has a lot to do with this idea, actually, of, in a way, almost like poets find circulation for the work, which goes beyond the idea of a physical transport of an object. Dittborn created that for visual art, because he made this invention of this aeropostales, aeropostal artworks. But maybe, Issa, you want to talk about the great piece in your show, because you have a beautiful piece in the show.
Yes, it's a wonderful piece. So the piece in the exhibition is titled Nine Survivors, and really looks at Eugenio's quite ingenious use of ready-made materials such as craft paper, but also of the envelope as a way to very clearly, cheaply participate in an exhibition, because he was able to very neatly fold the artwork and put it in the envelope and send it to the exhibition site. But it was also a way of him, repurposing reproduction techniques, of printing, of appropriating images, because he makes multiple references to different avenues and different drawings, but also in the way that he's also resignifying images. So, and in many ways honoring some of the traditional ways of documentation, I would say. So that piece, I think, is really interesting, because when you think about what is happening in the context of Latin America, specifically at this time, is that we see a lot of censorship, a lot of control, but this was a way to bypass that. This was a way to think about not just the physical writings on a piece of paper, but the object itself. And I think this was a common theme, right, between Latin American artists as well, and specifically the Chilean artists, when they're thinking about what is art and what are these bigger questions related to the object.
But Issa, sorry, you said something very important, but I think we have to keep in mind about Eugenio Dittborn. I think Eugenio Dittborn is a very important artist. He's an essential, he should be in a different position, I think, to say the less. But I think it's important that he kept the definition of painting in the art. I think that makes the difference in that gesture of resignifying images.
Yeah, I completely agree. And this was one of these big moments for me when I did get the chance to meet him. It was almost an emotional, cathartic journey and experience to see not only his output, because that was very high, but also the way that he's thinking and the way that he's rethinking the object and painting as a whole. And I think, Hans, you bring up the really important, and you refer to it in the book as well, is the oil painting almost in the desert in Chile, where he goes and he pours the oil in the desert, and which of course now would not happen due to environmental concerns, but still makes a certain point today.
Yeah, he created again, these are all works which are ephemeral, and obviously that's another thing which I think is important part of this oral art history, that we can somehow, remember. There's something, I think, really also about amnesia, which these books are about, or which my entire interview project is about, because I think we live in a world where we have an increasing amount of information, but that does not necessarily always mean that there is more memory. There's amnesia at the core somewhere also of this digital age. And so, in a way, the historian Eric Hobsbawm often talked about the necessity of a protest against forgetting. And so the book tries to, in a way, document a lot of these ephemeral moments. Silvia Palacio Wittmann is another artist. You mentioned the necessity for Eugenio Dittborn to be more known. Silvia Palacios Wittmann is another, really essential artist who lives outside New York, upstate, has an amazing performance practice, did these very radical performances about the hand, did very beautiful performances also in relation to drawing. And it's a practice which, that's of course also what is the hope, that a book like this can then lead to a deeper investigation of these practices, and hopefully also to individual, to shows of these artists, to individual monographic books, because they're, missing monographic books on many of these artists. And that's something which, and I think one of the things which is important, I think, because you asked me at the beginning how this began, and I really forgot an essential kind of detail about how it began, because so when I started in the 80s as a teenager, late 80s, to make these studio visits, one day I went to see Rosemarie Trockel in Cologne, who is now a very, very famous well-known artist. And, at the time I was like 17 and she was 33. And she said, that she's very touched that I would visit young artists like her, but that there are so many amazing visionary artists who are under the radar. And that she really thinks that it's the job of a curator, which I would become, to basically visit these artists and, in a way, create visibility. And we talked a lot at the time about Louise Bourgeois, because Louise Bourgeois was one of the first, also female artists who in the 80s started to have a lot of visibility internationally. And she says, there's all these female artists who have not had the attention, and that's your job. And ever since, in a city, I sort of ask this question and would then visit sort of pioneering artists. So it's become a kind of a methodology. And I think through the book, I mean, the reason also why to kind of gather these conversations in a book is that there is also a possibility really to see how all of these artists kind of connect to each other. And we can actually see how they somehow form groups and then also leave the groups. And it's very interesting, for example, in the conversation of another really well-known Chilean artist, Alfredo Jar, who also always answers to very specific contexts, We see with him that he's really only partially part of the Chilean scene because he felt highly uncomfortable with his idea how actually the avant-garde, what is often referred to as the escena de avanzada, this sort of avant-garde scene, how they actually, in a way, were controlled by certain critics. He found that very suffocating, and he found, in a way, that it almost replicated something authoritarian he didn't like, right? And so, and to kind of read that, I think it's also very interesting, and see how he then, for that reason, left and did not want to be part, of these groups. Yeah.
I think there's, sorry, Gabriela.
Sorry, no, I want to mention about, now that you're talking about those exceptional artists, I think we have to recuperate the work of Carmen Bechat, because Carmen Bechat is a missing link between New York and Chile, and between sculpture, performance, and painting. Carmen Bechat was part of the 112 Green Street. She danced with Trisha Brown, and she was part of the natural history of the American dancer. So she belonged to the neo-avant-garde in the 70s, and she was very much there. But she always had Chile in mind, unlike Silvia Palacios Whitman, who really, stayed in New York and became part of that neo-avant-garde. Carmen went back, so on and on. And she participated with Juan Downey in several performances, and Gordon Matta Clark. So I think she's a missing link. She's a very important person to be seen and to put into that table of people who are exceptional.
Absolutely. I think it's really interesting here because we're talking about this journey, this traveling that we could see with the Chilean artists, but also with a lot of Latin American artists, even from, the modernist periods with Barradas and Joaquin Torres Garcia, leaving, the Latin American continent to go and, get inspiration or work within the avant-garde groups in Europe. But I want to talk more also a little bit about these newly found artistic havens in New York, right? That community building that now exists outside of Chile. What was that doing? And you both touch on it briefly, but I think if you can expand on what does that mean then for representation? What does that mean for the type of artworks that they're working with? And has it expanded the practice and the viewpoints?
And I have not much to say about that, but I think it's important to consider the exile. Exile is the theory of the trauma and the theory of making productive that trauma. I can talk about that because I'm Venezuelan, so we are in the exile, 8 million people. So Chileans were, in exile. They were shattered everywhere, right?
Yeah, I think notions of exile is very important, and I think in the book we have different exiles, And again, Jonas Mekas always said there is voluntary exile, involuntary exile, many different exiles. There isn't such a thing like one notion of exile, and I think that comes up in many of the interviews. There is temporary exiles, there is exiles, very long duration exiles, but I think also the way how, to come back to Silvia Palacio Whitman, whom I've been particularly passionate about, and visited her, and also Robert Whitman then also in their studio and house, upstate New York. It's very interesting how her trajectory is kind of intertwined both with the Chilean avant-garde of the 60s and then also with the US avant-garde of the 60s. Because obviously Silvia Whitman was close to Susanne Weil, there's a very beautiful book which Rauschenberg edited about these two amazing, artists, about Susan Weil and Sylvia Wittmann, who both should be much, much more well known. And I think it's fascinating how it sort of connects to, and I mean, Carmen Böscher, it's similar. It connects in both directions. No?
The difference is that Sylvia was very much part of the New York avant-garde, neo-avant-garde, whereas Carmen remained like in the middle of the two. To the extent that Carmen lives in Chile now. She lives in a mountain very far in the south. And she participated in several actions against the dictatorship during the 70s in New York, like Cecilia Vicuña. Cecilia Vicuña was always living in London, then in Colombia, then in New York, but she had, it's the difference between immigration and exile. If you have the point of origin in your brain, that's an exile, but if you don't have it, if it blurs, it's not anymore, right?
This is all really interesting, specifically, and when we're thinking about some of the underpinnings of the book, but also Hans, with your thinking, and Gabriela Rangel, also with your, appreciation of Glissant and, the relationship between, for example, Glissant and Lydie Cabrera, which you explored in your wonderful exhibition. I think it would be interesting to explore a little bit about these ideas of artistic creativity, but also this remapping that occurs, right? There's almost this newly formed vision of Chile through these artworks.
Yes, but before going there, but I kind of stay with the previous question just for a second, because it's interesting, if you think about, so Palacios Wittmann, connecting in a way to Susan Weil, is also the kind of connection to the Black Mountain College, And it's the necessity we have today, I think, for a new Black Mountain College. We need situations where the disciplines can come together. And so in a way, when I record these histories, it's not out of nostalgia, but it's actually that they're kind of a toolbox, hopefully, what we can do today, in a way. And I think that we can learn for today. And it's very fascinating, I went to visit because also of Sylvia Palacios Wittmann, Susan Weil. And Susan Weil, studied at the Black Mountain College. And I think we should never forget the importance of such, institutions like the Black Mountain College in bringing the disciplines together. And I was very fascinated, Issa, to see in the exhibition you and Malba did, here about the Costantini collection, to see the encounter between Košice and Saraceno. Because about 24, 25 years ago, I was invited, it was in 2000, to teach at the university in Venice, the UAF. And it was at the same time as my friend Stefano Boeri, the architect, was also invited to teach there. And so the first day we arrived there, we thought, why wouldn't we bring art and architecture together? So we combined the class, and every architect student had to do something with an artist and vice versa for the graduate exhibition at the end. So we, Vasari idea, we don't separate art and architecture. And the first student we had there in the class was Thomas Saraceno. And so and I always believe, we not only teach, but we also learn from the students. So I asked every participant, and also didn't call them students, which is important, we called them participants. So in every of these participants, we called them young artists, not students. We asked them all, if there would be a person, sort of a pioneer or an artist from previous generations, they would like to bring into the course. And Thomas was the first one to answer. And he said, I want to bring Giulia Košice into your class. So then, Košice was already, when I last saw him last, he was 100, but he was already in his 80s then, or maybe late 80s. So it was kind of too complicated to get him to Venice for a seminar, and there wasn't Zoom, right? So it was kind of pre-Zoom. So we brought him into the seminar through a speakerphone, so a landline, and then connecting that to the speaker, and then the loudspeaker. So we had Thomas Saraceno and Košice kind of in conversation. For me, that idea of bringing the fields together, bringing the disciplines together is really important. So that's to your question from before. Yeah. Gabriela, maybe you want to answer the new question.
No, I think in that case, Hans, you're right. The Košice and Saraceno connection is very interesting because what you see in the exhibition is also a way that Saraceno is referencing, Gego as well, which is also referencing Leon Ferrari, who's also working with ideas in possible architecture, which also in many ways goes back to Košice and these hydrospatial cities, right? Where he's thinking about these very big or kind of referring back to the universe in many ways, these wider conversations. And I think this would be maybe one of my last questions, and then we can open it up to the audience. But what are some of these urgent conversations you think that artists in Latin America are having now that we haven't discussed so far, or that they should be having or can be having within the next few years? Kind of future outlook. What is the future outlook of Latin American art from your perspective? It's a big question.
I think Latin America is not the Latin America that your exhibition refers to. It's very difficult to talk about Latin America outside of their own countries. There is no, since after globalization, the notion of Latin America became problematized, there. And I think everybody talks about their own locality. I don't know. I think it's interesting because, I'm working a lot with Mexico now. And I think in Mexico, for the first time that I've seen after, the 30s, of course, and they're talking about Latin America, but it's a symptom. I think it's a symptom against, not against, but a little bit like nuancing globalization. So I don't know, it depends where you are. I mean, the southern cone, it's different from the rest. I think if you go to the south, it's totally different. If you go to Central America, it's different. If you go to the Caribbean, it's different. And Brazil, it has its own muscle. And Mexico, it's in between the US and what we call Latin America.
Yeah, I agree, and I see amazing, young artists emerge in all these countries. I mean, we did an exhibition at the Serpentine with Gabriela Massan, which is a collective work where they worked on a video game. We spoke this morning over breakfast with Gabriela about our research in Mexico, where we have amazing, we met amazing young artists. But I think, because we haven't answered your question from before, and I think we should, about Glissant. And I think it's interesting because when we did the exhibition, because Asad Raza and I curated this show on Glissant, invited by Gabriela at the American Society when you were there, and something very interesting happened, because basically, Glissant has always been my toolbox, Edouard Glissant, and Gabriela said there is another toolbox you don't know, which is, Lydia Cabrera. And I do think that as this is a panel about oral history, it's a panel about an interview book, I do think it would be really fascinating, following this question of Issa Gabriela, if you would talk a little bit about Lydia Cabrera, because I would love everybody here to know about Lydia Cabrera, because it really changed my life, and you introduced me to Cabrera's work, and I think the focus on that could be nice.
Thank you. You're touching my heart with that question. Seriously, I think it's a very unfair case of invisibilization, because she was trapped in between being a rebel against the revolution, the Cuban Revolution, and being a rebel against the counter-revolution. She wasn't caught in the middle. She was not a counter-revolutionary, she was not a revolutionary, but she was a revolutionary in reality. Lydia Cabrera, this is a white woman who decided, she was very close to Lorca, to Gabriela Mistral, and then she kept a network of more than 20 ethnographers in the world, including Glissant, who was part of this group. And there is no Wilfredo Lam without Lydia Cabrera. There is, that's for sure. Cuba is not Cuba without Lydia Cabrera. She did something very smart. At the beginning of the century, she noticed that nobody was paying attention to that culture, the black culture in Cuba. And then she translated that culture into literature and into oral histories, what you're doing, oral histories. And then she wrote this amazing book called El Monte. Sounds familiar, you know? And for the first time, El Monte was translated into English last year. But what I discovered in her archive in Miami is that Miami is a city that she was confined to. She didn't like to living in Miami, but she lived there, you know, after the revolution. She escaped. She lived until she died there. And she kept letters and exchanges with people like Alfred Métro, Pierre Berger, Roger Baptiste, Roger Calois, and she translated them. Not only that, but she participated. So, you know, the African diaspora in Cuba and the religion and culture is indebted forever to Lidia Cabrera. But people don't know this. And I'm very grateful for, you know, the centrality that you give to her, because she's going to have a central role now in an exhibition at MoMA dedicated to Wilfredo Lam.
Yeah, the Wilfredo Lam retrospective, which Christoph Scherix, no, is curating.
Yes, Christoph Scherix and Beverly Adams.
Yeah, yeah. And then in relation actually to, Issa, to your last question, I think that could almost be the topic of a next panel we are doing hopefully together, is about, you know, this amazing new generation which is emerging in, you know, in Latin America. And, you know, I want to bring it kind of back to Chile, because I do think that there is an incredibly interesting new generation, you know, in Chile. Recently I encountered Patricia Dominguez, who we co-curated a show with Patricia and Jeppe Ugelwig about artists who actually work on sort of mission-driven, they work as sort of mission-driven entrepreneurs, you know, environmental structures and so on. And we did a whole exhibition with the UN at the moment of the climate summit, and Patricia Dominguez co-curated that. And I think, you know, there is a very interesting new generation, but then there's also artists who are more well-known, like Adrian Villarrojas, who have, you know, for many years exhibited internationally. They're also, for them it's very important often to also keep, you know, local structures. It's very interesting that Adrian not only exhibits globally, but actually has a farm in Rosario. So anyway, but that would be, go far beyond the time frame of the panel today. We should do another panel about the new generation.
Completely. On that note, I think we're out of time, actually. So I would like to just open it up for one or two questions from the audiences. If anyone has, just raise your hand and we can pass a mic. I think there are no questions. I mean,
but maybe we should tell the story of what happened at breakfast then, because something really great happened at breakfast this morning, which has to do with your question about the future, but it's about the immediate future. Because so Gabriela, you know, told us about Guy Bonsiepe, and I've been actually reading Guy Bonsiepe's book on design, which came out, was kind of re-edited quite recently, which is an incredible book on design. But first of all, and you told us this morning, I had no idea that Guy Bonsiepe was still alive. I had no idea there was this connection to Chile, and I had no idea about this, you know, cybernetic thing, which interests me a lot, also in relation. So I've already...
Sorry, but I forgot to tell you that, you know, Apple was modeled after this model. Mm-hmm. I mean, Steve Jobs said that, not me.
And so, yeah, and so what happened at breakfast is that Gabriela told us about that, and I've already written an email to Guy Bonsiepe asking for an interview, so hopefully that will be the next chapter, so that's also the future.
I'm so excited to read the next editions of the book. Thank you all. Thank you, Gabriela. Thank you, Hans. Thank you to everyone in Qatar Creates and the audience here. We invite you to continue, but also to come visit the Latinoamericano exhibition that opens to the public tomorrow. Thank you all.